Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Charts with Dan. The show is up on Wednesday because I was prepping the show on Monday, and then final numbers just stopped coming in like halfway through. So I guess half the studios decided to take the Juneteenth holiday off, and half the studios decided to report final numbers. And given the fact that we have so much actual data that I wanted to break down this week, I decided to wait the extra day to upload the show because we are talking about The Flash and Elemental, and maybe one of the grimmest weekends in recent box office history, because neither one of those movies was able to really launch at the box office in any way, shape, or form. Two big flops at the same time. I think when we look back at this month of June, this could be one of the most documented and analyzed box office months of all time, because we had all of these movies just lined up, one after the other, right after the other, right after the other, and really only one of them, Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, has been able to break through. Maybe it helps that that's also really the only one of the big movies that came out this month that was well received. And we still have Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny coming out on the last weekend of June, which could very well repeat this same scenario that we've seen. So let's look at the box office for this weekend. And let's look first of all at the top five for the 3-day weekend. So this is Friday through Sunday, which saw The Flash opening to just over $55 million, far below what even the less optimistic, the most pessimistic tracking was thinking just a week or two ago. The movie just wasn't able to get any traction. The word of mouth campaign didn't work. Warner Brothers was hyping it up. Celebrities were hyping it up. People that saw it at CinemaCon were hyping it up, but the audience just didn't show up. They also didn't show up for the second place film, Elemental, at $29.6 million, which is arguably even a bigger box office disappointment than The Flash. It makes Lightyear's debut last year look great, and I remember when Lightyear debuted last summer, everyone was going like, oh my god, what a terrible debut for a Pixar movie. Well, Elemental just blew all of that out of the water. And we're going to look at the DCEU and Pixar and see where those two films fell historically in just a few minutes. In third place for the 3-day weekend was Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, a 51% drop in its third week, and competitive really for second place with Elemental, just over $27 million for the 3 days. Then Transformers Rise of the Beast didn't have the best debut last week and then dropped 66% in week 2. The cannibalization was just horrific this week, $20.6 million. The Little Mermaid drops 52% in its fourth week for an $11 million finish in fifth place. Then in sixth place, the opening of the new comedy, The Blackening, which thank goodness did not have a $200 million budget. It opened to just over $6 million, followed by Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 in seventh place. With a 26.8% drop, it continues to hold well and a $5.2 million total. The horror film The Boogeyman in its third week takes eighth place with $3.6 million. And in ninth place, we have the Indian film Adipurush. This is all versions of the film. There were some in the Telugu language and some in other languages. $2.5 million total for the 3-day weekend, and still hanging on to the top 10 is Fast X. Another big drop, 59.9% in week 5 for a $2.1 million total. Dropping out of the top 10 this past weekend, we had 4 movies after 10 weeks, really the only or one of the only box office sensations this year so far, and it's almost half over. The Super Mario Brothers movie is now officially out of the top 10, followed by About My Father and The Machine after 3 weeks each in the top 10, and Past Lives after 1 week, although it will be expanding nationwide this upcoming weekend. Looking at the box office road to recovery, that dotted black line is the weekend box office total for this year, 2023. The blue line is the average box office take for the years of 2015 to 2019. The red line is the average weekend box office take for the years 2021 to 2022. And you see that we're kind of right in the middle there. Last year, we had Jurassic World Dominion in its second weekend. That was the highest performing film for 2021 and 2022. But the pre-pandemic era, this was a powerhouse weekend. Both Jurassic World and Incredibles 2 debuted on this weekend in 2015 and 2018 respectively, and so that's why the average is so high there. There was a thought at one time that maybe total ticket sales domestically for this weekend could have topped $200 million, because if The Flash did well, let's say it opened to $70 million, and let's say that Elemental opens to $50 or $60 million, then the other movies could fill in and get us to over $200 million. Yeah, that's not what happened. It was pretty much a worst case scenario for both of the high-profile new releases this past weekend. Looking at box office grosses for the 4-day Juneteenth weekend, The Flash came out with a $61.2 million total, followed by Elemental with $34.9 million, and right behind it, Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse with $33.1 million. It was actually the more popular selection for moviegoers on Monday than Elemental, so we should actually look this upcoming weekend to see if Across the Spider-Verse could perhaps overtake Elemental at the box office. Transformers Rise of the Beast in fourth place with just over $24 million. Then The Little Mermaid with $13.7 million. The Blackening with $7.1 million. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 with $6.2 million. The Boogeyman at $4.4 million. Adipurush at $2.7 million. And Fast X at $2.4 million. So let's look at the summer box office thus far, as we are pretty much at the halfway point, and Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 remains the number one movie of the summer so far. Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse moves up one spot to become the second highest grossing film of the summer, and it's about $60 million behind Guardians Volume 3. The Little Mermaid drops down one spot to number 3. Fast X stays at number 4. Transformers Rise of the Beast is now over $100 million domestically at number 5. The Flash debuts at number 6, followed by Elemental debuting at number 7, which drops The Boogeyman down 2 spots, Book Club The Next Chapter down 2 spots, and About My Father down 2 spots. The Machine and Love Again drop off of the 2023 summer box office. And when we look at my predictions versus the actual rankings so far, I predicted that The Little Mermaid would be number 1. That's not going to happen. I predicted that Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, though, would be number 2. That may happen. We'll take a look at that in just a minute. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, which I predicted is the third highest grossing film of the summer, is currently at number 1. I was high on The Flash. I bought into that buzz. I ranked it number 4 for the summer. That ain't happening. It probably didn't crack in the top 5. Hell, it may not crack the top 10 once all is said and done. Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1 hasn't come out yet. I picked that as my number 5 movie for the summer. Remember, these are all domestic totals. Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny comes out in a couple of weeks. I did pick Elemental as the 7th highest grossing film of the summer, which is where it is currently. However, it's going to be dropping fast and very well may not be in the top 10 this summer. I picked Fast X as the 8th highest grossing film of the summer. It's currently at number 4, but I like my chances there. It's going to be moving down. And then at numbers 9 and 10, I picked Oppenheimer and Barbie. The hype machine is just really building on those two movies, but they have yet to open. Looking outside the domestic marketplace for the top 5 films internationally, The Flash didn't really catch on around the world either. A $75 million debut around the world, and that included most major markets. Transformers Rise of the Beast is at number 2 with $37.2 million. Adipurush is at number 3 with $30.6 million. Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse at number 4 with $27.6 million. And then The Little Mermaid in 5th place with $15.3 million. When you combine those international numbers with our domestic numbers, you get the top 5 films worldwide over the past weekend, and The Flash ended up banking around $130 million total around the world, which would be a good number if the budget weren't ridiculously high, which we will talk about. Transformers Rise of the Beast at number 2 with $57.8 million. Right behind it is Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse with $54.6 million. Elemental is in 4th place with $44.6 million, and I'm not ringing the alarm bells quite yet on the worldwide total because this was not a day-and-date release for Elemental in all of the markets worldwide. It actually has yet to roll out in several major markets. So that is one thing that Elemental can maybe just like some kind of a life preserver that it is clinging on to right now, is that there are many countries in which it's not yet open. So perhaps it will be able to catch on in one of those other countries. You never really know. In 5th place is Adipurush, which brings in $33.1 million worldwide. So let's talk about The Flash and let's talk about Elemental and how they both fall into their respective franchises, and we will look first at The Flash and its opening weekend results. And when you look at it compared to the other films in the DCEU, it is able to open unadjusted for inflation just ahead of Shazam in 2019, but about $12 million behind what Black Adam opened to last fall. And I saw some articles, Deadline and other people, they sometimes put a little spin on their box office articles. I try not to do that here on this show, but saying like, well, what would you expect? The Flash is kind of a deeper DC character. I'm sorry. No way in hell is The Flash a deeper DC character than Black Adam, and you cannot spin the fact that it opened to a smaller box office total than Black Adam as anything other than a failure. The Flash should have easily opened to $70-80 million without Batman. But you throw in Michael Keaton's Batman and you throw in Supergirl, this movie should have opened a lot higher. There was obviously something going on with the marketing. There was obviously something going on with the messaging. Obviously, of course, something going on with the star of the movie. There was so much about this movie that failed to catch the public's interest. Looking at the DCEU opening weekends, when you do adjust for inflation, that bumps The Flash down to 9th, below 2019's Shazam, and it really then only comes in ahead of Wonder Woman 1984 and The Suicide Squad, which both had streaming day and date concerns, then Shazam! Fury of the Gods, which was an abject failure earlier this year, and Birds of Prey back in 2020, which had a much lower budget and again was one of the least successful films in the DCEU. This was a big swing for the franchise, and you cannot be on the same footing as some of your lesser films. Just to kind of set a baseline for where The Flash is as far as overall gross, right now it's at $61.2 million. It has already outgrossed the domestic totals of Wonder Woman 1984 and The Suicide Squad, which again had the day and date streaming to contend with, and also Shazam! Fury of the Gods, which came out earlier this year. But when you look at the road ahead, I mean, let's say it legs out to 2 times its opening weekend. That puts it behind 2019's Shazam. It really has to have legs of almost 3 times its opening to match Black Adam in 2022. That is not where DC wants The Flash to be, whether they're resetting the universe or not. And when you look at its gross adjusted for inflation, it is now above only Wonder Woman 1984 and Shazam! Fury of the Gods. It will shortly pass the domestic adjusted gross of The Suicide Squad, but it'll then get above Birds of Prey, and that's probably about it. So again, really no spin that you can put on The Flash here. It is a massive disappointment for DC. Some people would say like, well, you know, maybe it's tempered by the fact that they weren't really looking to launch that character. No, they still pumped so much money and so much hype into this movie that for none of it to work, you have to think it's not just constrained to this movie. You've got Blue Beetle on the schedule for later this summer. You've got Aquaman on the schedule for the end of this year. And really, if I'm James Gunn and Peter Safran, the thing that's keeping me awake at night is, okay, so to what extent will this disinterest go to the reboot of Superman Legacy that they're planning, and all of these other films? And this is something I'm going to be addressing in detail on an episode of The News with Dan, which is going to come out tomorrow. I'm going to be looking at the history of the DCEU and also kind of flash pointing that DCEU history to see, could we have gotten to a better place right here in 2023 than where we are? So keep an eye out for that tomorrow because that's been a lot of fun to pull together. Finally, looking at The Flash by worldwide gross in the DCEU, it has outgrossed Shazam! Fury of the Gods already. It is behind the gross currently of Wonder Woman 1984, so it's going to pass that gross. It's going to pass The Suicide Squad. It'll pass Birds of Prey, but is it going to make $365 million in order to outgross Shazam? That's a good question, and one that we don't know the answer to just yet. So that's the story with The Flash, and if anyone is thankful for how The Flash performed at the box office this past weekend, it's the people at Pixar, because The Flash was such a high-profile film that it kind of hid the fact that Elemental had an even worse debut when you look at it by budget and when you look at it by how it compares to other films that Pixar has put out. So let's look at the franchise tracker for Pixar. This is all of the Pixar movies by wide opening weekend. I say wide opening weekend because some movies like A Bug's Life and Toy Story 2 opened in limited release. So these numbers reflect their first weekend in wide release. And you see that unadjusted for inflation, Elemental had the second worst opening for a Pixar film, only beating 1995's Toy Story. A Bug's Life in 1998 made more money 25 years ago than Elemental did this weekend. And I'm not going to run over all of these films as far as opening weekend. You can kind of pause it if you want to. Incredibles 2 had the highest opening weekend for a Pixar film of all time. But look at what happens when you adjust these numbers for inflation. Elemental is the worst opening weekend in Pixar's history as far as wide release goes, and it's really not even close. $29.6 million. The next movie up is Onward in 2020 at $45.9 million. And keep in mind that Onward opened at a time when people were already kind of iffy about going to the theaters. There were kind of rumblings about the coronavirus and whether it was safe, etc. So there are definitely some asterisks there that you could put on Onward. So Elemental, in what should be a rejuvenated theatrical atmosphere, still puts in $16 million less than Onward when you adjust for inflation. It's a little more than half of what Lightyear opened to last summer. And again, remember, going back to charts and everything, we were all scratching our heads with Lightyear saying, well, how could a Pixar movie open so low? Well, Elemental has made it look better, I guess, by comparison, but it is, when you adjust for inflation, easily the worst opening weekend in the history of Pixar. Looking at these kind of baseline numbers, by total domestic gross, you see that Incredibles 2, again, easily the highest grossing film in Pixar history, $608.5 million, followed by Finding Dory, Toy Stories 4 and 3, and then Finding Nemo. Elemental so far has made $34.9 million. Let's say it triples up on its opening weekend. You know what? Let's say it quadruples up. Let's say that people really want to go see it and it gets to $140 million. That only gets it to number 21. Above The Good Dinosaur. That really only gets it above 3 other Pixar movies. So really, when we look at the best case scenario for Elemental right now, it's still a flop. And when you look at it by domestic gross adjusted for inflation, again, let's give it 4 times legs, meaning it gets to about $140 million. It's below The Good Dinosaur. The only consolation would be that it would be ahead of Lightyear last summer, but that's saying that it caught on with people. Now, cinema score for the movie was strong. It got an A cinema score, so there's a possibility that it hangs around, but 4 times legs, that's being very generous. So Elemental, really another sign that Pixar is in big trouble. And then if you're looking at Disney, you had Ant-Man and the Lost Quantumania, a huge underperformance this year already. The Little Mermaid, the live action version, due to its huge budget, a huge underperformance already. Pixar, the lowest opening in Pixar's history when you adjust for inflation. Probably going to lose a healthy amount of money for the studio, which we're going to look at in a second. Strange World, going back to the end of last year for Walt Disney Animation, a massive flop, tens of millions of dollars lost. So every single major part of the Disney cinematic empire, their animation, Pixar, Disney, live action, all of it not really showing great results lately. And that's not to say that everybody else is doing great, but at the same time, there have to be a lot of worried, anxious people over there right now, because all of a sudden the Disney hit factory is only churning out a hit or 2 every once in a while. The rest are small victories or outright bombs. Finally, looking at the Pixar franchise tracker by worldwide gross, there are a few extra movies here because Soul, Luca, and Turning Red, which did not get domestic theatrical releases, did get theatrical releases in some parts of the world. So you see that Elemental has outgrossed Luca and Turning Red, which are only in a few countries, but it's still behind Soul back in 2020, which actually made $118.7 million around the world. If it can get to around $200 million, then it will be competing with Lightyear. But this is perhaps, of all the charts, something we just don't quite know yet because there are so many markets left to go with Elemental. So I can't really project what it's going to do because, like I said, there's so many countries where it hasn't premiered. So this is kind of a TBD chart. But let's talk about not just Elemental and The Flash, but so many of these big blockbuster summer films. And I want to look at specifically movies that had big budgets, $100 million plus budgets, and where they stand as far as turning a profit in the theatrical window. And I always preface this, but people are always asking, these things that I'm about to show you, these are calculations based on market estimates, and it's something that I standardize across all movies. Some studios like Disney get a bigger slice of the pie from theaters, so their income may be a little bit bigger, but this is kind of just a rough idea for how these movies might stand. And this doesn't include things like if you have promotional partners and tie-ins, that can be $150 million that's coming in if you're paired up with a lot of brands and stuff that's not here on the chart. This is just about how much money are you making from ticket sales. And even though you like to have all the tie-ins and everything else, the merchandising, I think studios also would like for a movie to break even just in the theatrical window, because then all of that other stuff is extra profit on top of that. So let's look first at Elemental and see where it stands financially and what it needs to make in order to break even in the theatrical window. So about $1.2 million coming in from China, about $5.5 million coming in internationally thus far, and about $20.9 million coming in so far from its domestic ticket sales. The budget for the film, huge, $200 million reportedly. I'm giving it a print and advertising budget of $100 million. That is standard for a movie of its size. If I hear another figure, then I will will update this chart. That puts the cost for Elemental at $300 million. Its total worldwide gross right now is $49.9 million. The net from that I have calculated at $27.6 million, which means that Elemental needs to generate another $272.3 million in profit to break even in the theatrical window. And keep in mind, the most lucrative part of that scenario often is the domestic release, where it is not doing well. So if Elemental wants to have any hope of breaking even theatrically, then it has to stick around for quite some time domestically, do very well, and then do very well around the world in a lot of the markets where it hasn't opened yet. I'm not saying that's impossible, but I think it's very unlikely, and I think it is much more likely that Disney's going to lose a fair amount of money on Elemental. Let's look at the other big movie that opened this weekend, The Flash. $13.7 million was made in China. About $2.7 million of that comes back to investors. $59.5 million made in other countries. 40% of that comes back to investors. And then a 60% share of the $61.2 million that's made so far domestically translates to about $36.7 million. The budget on The Flash reported to be about $225 million. I've seen other things saying with reshoots it was $300 million. That is one figure that's out there, but 225 seems to be the one that many people, many trades, etc. have settled on. So let's say 225 for the budget, another $100 million for marketing. That means you have a total cost for The Flash of $325 million, a gross so far of $134.4 million, which nets you about $63.2 million, which means The Flash needs to bring in another $261.7 million in theatrical revenues. And it's not like Elemental. There are not a lot of countries out there where it has yet to open. So this could translate into a big problem because, David Zaslav, the whole reason that he shelved Batgirl and took all the shows off HBO Max that he took off was because he was trying to cut costs. The Flash could potentially cost the studio $100 million or more, depending on how it does in the days and weeks ahead. And something else to keep in mind, and I was reading this, is that because of all of the issues with Ezra Miller, The Flash had far fewer promotional partners than a movie of its size. And the numbers that I read said that it could have left $85, $100, $125 million on the table. That's all money that could have come in to mitigate this theatrical loss for The Flash that Warner Brothers is not getting. So Elemental, perhaps right now, may seem to be in a bit of a tougher financial position theatrically, but there's a lot of merchandising and a lot of tie-ins that you have with Elemental that you do not have with The Flash. And so I think at the end of the day, The Flash has the potential to be a much bigger money loser for the studio, if not on paper theatrically, overall when you look at the balance sheets. But it's not just The Flash and Elemental. So many of these big blockbuster movies that we've looked at so far this summer have had a tough road to profitability in the theatrical window, and it's usually because of their massive budgets. So let's run over a few of them right now, starting with Fast X. Fast X had a budget reportedly, this is insane, $340 million. You add $100 million in marketing costs. That's $440 million out the door before you even start making anything. And Fast X is deep into its run worldwide. I have its total gross at $695.5 million. When you add in all of the shares that are coming back from box office cuts in China, internationally, etc., I have the movie netting $274 million. But when the movie costs $440 million, I still have Fast X short $165.9 million theatrically before it breaks even. So this is a movie, despite the fact that it's done almost $700 million worldwide, that could lose $100 million plus for the studio in the theatrical window. The Little Mermaid, we mentioned from Disney, a $250 million budget and then a reported marketing cost of $140 million. So that's $390 million that Disney sunk into the movie, a $467.9 million gross around the world. Hey, almost $500 million. That sounds great. Yeah, but you spent $390 million. The net so far that I've calculated is $229.5 million as far as money coming back in, which means that The Little Mermaid is short about $160.4 million to break even in the theatrical window. This movie, though, may be in the best position as far as merchandising and selling toys and selling, dolls and everything else. That is probably where The Little Mermaid maybe can make some of this money back. But again, losing $100 million plus theatrically, I don't think that's what Disney wanted. Let's look at Transformers Rise of the Beast, $195 million budget. Another marketing spend, let's say $100 million for a movie of its size. That's a total cost of $295 million. So far, I have it bringing in $278.7 million. From what it's brought in, I've got it netting $139.4 million, which means that it's about $155 million short of breaking even in the theatrical window. And again, you've got toys, you have other things there, but I mean, good grief, this is not chump change. These are movies that are losing 150, 175, 200, $250 million theatrically for these studios. This is insanity. And so much of it comes down to budget. And then I think studios just overestimating that people are going to show up for these franchises. This could be a sea change creatively for studios, especially when they're mapping things out, like DC mapping out, all these different movies and saying like, well, it's a DC movie. People are going to show up. Or Disney saying, well, it's a Marvel movie, so we know how many people minimum are going to show up. Maybe not. It may very well be that audiences are saying, no, if you want me to show up and not wait to watch it at home or whatever else, then you've really got to give me something special. And I don't think that it's any coincidence that Warner Brothers and Disney are struggling right now, because they are also the two studios that devalued the most the theatrical experience during the pandemic. Disney sending things to Disney Plus and saying like, no, watch it on Disney Plus, it's as good as theatrical. And then Warner with HBO Max and their whole Project Popcorn thing saying you can watch it in theaters or at home. They condition their audiences to watch things at home. And now that the shift has gone back to theatrical, and also quite frankly, now that the market has shown that streaming may not be the cash cow that so many studios thought it would be, a lot of these studios are also finding out that sending their audiences to streaming may have been a one-way street. You may not get them back in theaters unless you make something really special. And really, when you look at the two movies this summer that I have projecting to have broken even and become profitable in the theatrical window, I think they have that in common. They promised audiences something special, and even more importantly, they delivered. The Flash also promised something special, but I don't quite think it delivered. This movie did, though. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, very popular with audiences. It had a budget of $250 million, so the cost was sunk about as much into this movie as the other ones, but people liked this film. It was very well reviewed, and when you look at the gross so far, $820.6 million, I calculate about $364.2 million of that coming back, and against the $350 million cost, the theatrical profit I have at about $14.2 million. And that may not sound like much, but number one, this is Disney, and Disney often will demand a bigger chunk of the box office from these different theaters. So they very well may have brought in more than I'm calculating. Like I say, I kind of standardize this for all movies across the board. And secondly, even if it is a small profit theatrically, that means that you have broken even. So all of those brand partners and digital media revenue and Blu-ray sales or whatever else, that's all adding to that profit margin. You're not kind of trying to still make up the losses from the theatrical side. So Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, I have as a moneymaker this summer. And then the other one, an even bigger moneymaker right now, and largely because it had a responsible budget, was Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse. A great combination here of delivering a movie that audiences liked and keeping it at a low budget point. $100 million budget, $100 million on marketing. That means costs of $200 million. The gross right now, just under $500 million worldwide. I have right now a net of $238.8 million, which means that I've got Across the Spider-Verse showing a theatrical profit of $38.8 million so far, and it still has some life left in it in the theatrical window. We could get up to 50, 75, $100 million worth of profit. That's not quite where the Super Mario Brothers movie, for example, was earlier this year, but still, they were able to budget the movie responsibly and deliver a good movie. And I think that that's really the killer combination. Make the movie for a responsible amount and deliver a good movie. It seems simple, and yet all of these other studios have had trouble doing it this summer. And when you look at how Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse is doing, it is now the 7th highest grossing film in the Spider-Verse franchise altogether. It has passed the domestic gross of The Amazing Spider-Man and Venom Let There Be Carnage, as well as 2018's Venom, The Amazing Spider-Man 2, Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, and Morbius. If it banks another $50 million or so, it will pass Spider-Man Homecoming and Spider-Man 3 on the all-time list, but we will see how it does. It is a very crowded summer. When you look at the Spider-Verse domestic box office, office adjusted for inflation, it is still number 8. It has bypassed The Amazing Spider-Man 2, but it is somewhat well behind The Amazing Spider-Man and Spider-Man Homecoming, so we'll see if it's able to make that progress when you look at those inflation-adjusted numbers. But looking at the race for number 1, what is the number 1 movie of the summer going to be? Well, it's not going to be The Little Mermaid, as I said. That's the orange line there, and it's really flattened out. There was a time where it was maybe competing with Guardians Volume 3, but that has not come to pass. But look at Across the Spider-Verse, which is the purple line, versus Guardians Volume 3. I think this is going to be a very interesting race because you'll see they're very tight on the weekends, and then during the weeks, Across the Spider-Verse will open up a bit of a lead, and then that'll tighten up again during the weekends. And that's because Guardians Volume 3 has held very well week to week when you look at the weekend box office. So even though Across the Spider-Verse is doing better during the week because people are out of school now, that's a big reason why Guardians came out in early May, Spider-Verse came out in June. If Across the Spider-Verse is not able to hold as well on the weekends as Guardians Volume 3 was, then it should actually fall short, and Guardians 3 will continue to be the number 1 movie of the summer. But Across the Spider-Verse is currently still on track to overtake its domestic gross. So if it just stays steady and holds where it is, then it will overtake Guardians 3 to become the summer number 1, unless, of course, a movie like Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1, which just had its premiere and is already getting that positive buzz, maybe that comes in and takes the number 1 spot. We just don't quite know yet. We've got so much more to get to, but before we do, I'm going to take a moment to thank this week's sponsors. This episode is brought to you by AG1, a daily foundational nutrition supplement that supports whole body health. You know, focusing on your health isn't just for the winter months, it's also important during the summer because it never hurts to boost your immune system against something like a summer cold. Ugh, those are the worst. I drink AG1 when I have my breakfast shake every day, and it makes me feel like I'm covering my nutritional bases and just starting the day off right. I've struggled in the past with keeping to a new routine, but drinking AG1 is as simple as having a glass of water or a breakfast shake in the morning. It's just 1 scoop of powder mixed with water once a day. That's it. Every scoop is packed with 75 vitamins, minerals, and whole food sourced ingredients, and it's delivered right to me every month, so it's been super easy to make it a daily habit. And the benefits like gut health and an overall energy boost have been noticeable. If you want to take ownership of your health, try AG1 and get a free 1-year supply of vitamin D and 5 free AG1 travel packs with your first purchase. Just go to drinkag1.com/Dan. That's drinkag1.com/Dan. Check it out. This episode is brought to you by Firstleaf. You know, summer's a great time, always exciting activities going on or more time to spend with friends and family. And that's why this was the perfect time to join the Firstleaf Wine Club. I love Firstleaf because they make it super easy to get personalized wine boxes delivered on my schedule so I don't have to worry about missing a delivery that I might have to sign for. And you know, a lot of my friends are wine experts and I am a total amateur, but that's not a problem because to get started with Firstleaf, all you have to do is answer some quick questions about your likes and dislikes on their website, and their expert team will select a customized assortment of world-class wines based on your preferences. And the questionnaire was super easy to fill out. I don't know all the names of the wines that I like yet, or I wouldn't even know what to ask for, but I described my specific tastes, and they packaged up a great first shipment for me. Your personalized wine shipments are delivered right to your door so you can kick back and enjoy bottles you'll love all summer long, and they're all priced lower than what you'd pay at a wine store. Plus, every selection is backed by Firstleaf's 100% satisfaction guarantee. To make sure you've got great wine when you want it this summer, you've got to try Firstleaf. Just head over to tryfirstleaf.com/Murrell to sign up, and you'll get your first 6 hand-curated bottles for just $44.95. Go to tryfirstleaf.com/Murrell. That's tryfirstleaf.com/Murrell to get your first 6 bottles for under $8 a bottle. Tryfirstleaf.com/Murrell. All right, let's look at some more numbers from this past weekend, and we'll start with the top per theater average. This is really the only good piece of box office news to come out. Asteroid City, Wes Anderson's latest film, had an incredible per theater average, $857,000 per theater in 6 theaters in New York and Los Angeles. Just for comparison, The Flash, which opened in 4,234 theaters, made $13,000 per theater. This is what you want to see if you're a small theater owner or if you're an owner in New York or Los Angeles where these open. This was basically every single showing sold out, lines around the block, blockbuster, bonanza, box office, you name it. This is what you want to see, and this is why it is actually quite lucrative in a large market to host independent films or be able to host things like the Wes Anderson movie or the latest Ari Aster movie or the latest big A24 movie, because the demand is there. In third place is Past Lives, another movie that put up a great opening weekend per theater average just a couple weeks ago, $8,951 per theater in 85 theaters. As I mentioned, it is going to expand this weekend to many more theaters nationwide. Elemental in fourth place was $7,336 in each of its 4,035 theaters. And Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, its theater count dips below 4,000, but it brings in $6,972 per theater. These are the top per theater averages for 2023 so far. And again, Asteroid City just demolishing the record for the year, $140,857. That tops Beau is Afraid, which opened to $80,000 per theater in 4 theaters back in April. Past Lives now at number 3 with $58,000 per theater in 4 theaters just a couple weeks ago. Then the Super Mario Bros. Movie, $33,701 per theater in 4,343 theaters. And then Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, just under $28,000 per theater in its opening weekend. And not only did Asteroid City put up a great per theater average for this year, it put up a great opening weekend per theater average for this decade. These are the opening weekend per theater averages for the 2020s. Asteroid City, again, demolishing that number one spot, $140,857. The second place film was Paul Thomas Anderson's Licorice Pizza, $86,000 per theater in 4 theaters back in November of 2021. Then we had Beau is Afraid this past April, and then Spider-Man No Way Home. This really should put into perspective just how many people went to see that movie opening weekend. Just under $60,000 per theater in 4,336 theaters back in December of 2021, which basically means that demand was so high for Spider-Man No Way Home, it was as if it was one of these movies that was only playing in a couple theaters on the coasts that you had to travel to go see, and that there was limited seating. It created that kind of demand. That is a very rare film. In 5th place is Past Lives, $58,067 per theater in 4 theaters, again, just a couple of weeks ago. Looking at the top films in limited release this past weekend, Audipurish was number 1 in 550 theaters with its $2.5 million total, followed by Asteroid City, $845,000 total in 6 theaters. Past Lives expanded to 85 theaters for a $760,000 total, followed by You Hurt My Feelings in 249 theaters for a total of $269,000, and Mauer in an unknown number of theaters in its second week, bringing in just over $80,000. And looking at the top films in limited release this year, this is all tickets sold since January 1st. Patan remains number 1. The re-release of Return of the Jedi is at number 2. A Man Called Otto is at number 3. Nefarious is at number 4. And Women Talking is at number 5. You Hurt My Feelings enters the top 10 at number 8. It bumps Mummies down to number 9. And Beau is Afraid down to number 10. Of course, these limited release and specialty box office films are often under the purview of the independent cinemas that are scattered across the country. And this week, as we've done every week for the past couple of months, I'm going to feature an independent theater somewhere here in the United States. And this week we are looking at the Gene Siskel Film Center in Chicago, Illinois. I am a Roger Ebert guy, but Gene Siskel was the other half of that duo, and I watch Siskel and Ebert every single week, so I am happy to highlight this particular theater. It was founded in 1972 as the Film Center of the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, but renamed the Gene Siskel Film Center in 2000, shortly after the death of Gene Siskel, who was not only a legendary film critic, but a legendary figure around Chicago. And the Gene Siskel Film Center is devoted to the promotion and preservation of classic and independent cinema, and also has a commitment to diverse and inclusive programming. This week alone, you can find screenings of the independent film Blue Jean as their first run feature, along with revivals of After Sun, The Lion King, Fences, The Mosquito Coast, Paper Moon, and Bicycle Thieves as part of their Daddy Issues film series exploring fatherhood on film. You can also catch 12 Angry Men there as part of their Science on Screen Halloween series, and that's just this week. When possible, the Siskel Film Center presents films on 35mm and also hosts numerous festivals and film celebrations throughout the year. You can find out more at siskelfilmcenter.org. They are also a 501c3 organization, which means that any donation you make is tax deductible, and you can donate on their website. If you go there and decide to catch one of those great movies or make a donation, please, as always, be sure to tell them that Dan sent you. Let's look at a couple of annual charts. First of all, the 2023 domestic box office chart. The Super Mario Bros. Movie dominating still at $572.2 million, followed by Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, which is nearing the $350 million mark. Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse should cross the $300 million mark sometime this week. It bumps up one spot to number 3. That moves The Little Mermaid down one spot to number 4 at $255.7 million. Ant-Man and the Wasp Quantumania is at number 5. John Wick Chapter 4 is at number 6. Creed 3 is at number 7. Fast X is at number 8. Scream 6 is at number 9. And Transformers Rise of the Beast enters the chart at number 10, which means for the first time this year, all 10 of the top 10 movies domestically have had grosses of over $100 million. Megan is dropped out of the domestic top 10. Looking at the calendar year box office, so these are all tickets sold since January 1st. Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse moves up to number 3. It has now outgrossed Avatar: The Way of Water in calendar year 2023. The Little Mermaid moves down one spot to number 5, followed by Ant-Man and the Wasp, John Wick Chapter 4, Creed 3, Fast X, and then Puss in Boots: The Last Wish, clinging on to that number 10 spot for the 2023 calendar year. And looking at the 2023 worldwide box office, the Super Mario Bros. Movie is there at $1.3 billion. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 at $820.6 million. Fast X, not a profitable movie, but certainly one that has made a lot of money, $695.5 million, now the third highest grossing film of the year globally. It's crazy to think about how in the red it still is. Full River Red is down one spot to number 4. The Wandering Earth 2 is at number 5. Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, a big jump to number 6, 3 spots from last week. The Little Mermaid moves up one spot to number 7. Ant-Man and the Wasp Quantumania and John Wick Chapter 4 both jump down 2 spots. And Transformers Rise of the Beast also enters this chart at $278.7 million, knocking Creed 3 out of the worldwide top 10. Before we go, as always, I want to take a look at a weekend in box office history, and we're going back to a very important week for me because my mind was blown on this weekend 30 years ago. We're going back to June 11th through the 13th, 1993, the 24th weekend of the year, which saw the debut of Steven Spielberg's Jurassic Park to $50.1 million at the box office. Man, that is one of those movie-going weekends I will never forget. My grandmother took me to the movie. There were people sitting in the aisles, and I lost count of the number of times I saw that movie in the theaters. One of the most incredible things I'd seen in my life up to that point. In second place was the Sylvester Stallone thriller Cliffhanger in its third week. It dropped 37.3% for a $7.6 million total and an overall box office total of $49.6 million. Then in third place, week 3 of the Whoopi Goldberg Ted Danson comedy Made in America, dropping 37% for a $4.7 million weekend total and a $29 million box office total. In fourth place was the second week of the Rebecca De Mornay, Don Johnson vehicle Guilty as Sin. $3.6 million for the weekend, $11.4 million total. And then in fifth place, in its 6th week of release, was the Kevin Kline comedy Dave, co-starring Sigourney Weaver, Frank Langella, many other people. A 37.2% drop, a $3 million weekend total, and a $51.6 million box office total. I don't know if Dave is one of those comedies from the 90s that people still watch or talk about, but if you haven't seen Dave, it's actually really good. It's about this average, everyday dude who happens to look just like the president, and they enlist him to stand in for the president after there's a medical emergency. It's actually a really, really funny movie, and I highly recommend it if you haven't seen it or if you haven't heard of it. Of course, we don't just let these box office results sit where they are. We want to see what these numbers look like in today's dollars, which means we're going to hit the inflation button, and once we hit that button, we see that these numbers are adjusted to $105.5 million for Jurassic Park. Of course, it would go on to be the highest grossing film in history to that point. Cliffhanger's adjusted total was $16 million for a domestic total adjusted of just over $100 million. Then Made in America with $9.9 million and a $61 million domestic total. Guilty as Sin at $7.6 million and a $24 million adjusted total. And then Dave with $6.3 million in its 6th week and a domestic total of just over $108.8 million. And that does it for another edition of Charts with Dan. There are many things that you can catch that are new this weekend in theaters, as well as a lot of other things that you probably haven't seen yet. First of all, tonight there's a special event called Mad Heidi, which is a take on the classic literary character. It's actually gotten somewhat positive critical reviews, so it looks like it's not a Winnie the Pooh Blood and Honey situation. It also co-stars former friend of Screen Junkies, Casper Van Dien. So if you want to check out Mad Heidi, it has special screenings tonight. On Friday, the Jennifer Lawrence R-rated comedy No Hard Feelings opens in wide release. Wes Anderson's Asteroid City also expands nationwide. Past Lives expands nationwide. And then director Nick Cassavetes' film God is a Bullet will also be playing in many theaters nationwide, starring Nikolai Coster-Waldau and Jamie Foxx. Also opening in limited release this Friday is Carrie Fisher's last released film, Wonderwell, which has been stuck in post-production limbo for many years, finally getting a release this upcoming weekend. And also in limited release, a documentary called The Last Rider about legendary American cyclist Greg LeMond. I'll be covering a lot of those movies right here on the channel later this week, as well as the news that will be up tomorrow, looking at the DCEU. I may be doing a streaming charts episode because I don't know if you saw this, but Netflix has changed the way that they are reporting their metrics to have the total hours viewed divided by the total runtime, which sounds like a very familiar metric. So I think I'm going to talk about that on streaming charts this week, as well as whatever might come across my desk. Thank you so much for spending part of your day with me. Be sure to check out the description for all of this week's great sponsors. But most of all, I appreciate your time. Until next time, stay safe, and I'll see you then. Bye.